Today I want to talk about oil painting. I'm talking here primarily about a setup for students, for hobbyists, for those who don't have a dedicated workspace, and I'll introduce you to the act of oil painting itself too throughout this series. What we're working on here right now is a palette. Most of us have in mind the traditional art palette that we might have seen from oil painters from days gone by. This is one of my wooden oil palettes that I use to hold over my arm so that I can lay out my art. When I'm working on a large painting and the palette needs to move with me, I really enjoy this palette. The palette I'm sharing with you today is called a Masterson palette. These are able to be bought in most art supply stores. You can see the name Masterson here. What this looks like is really a giant Tupperware box, but we use it specifically for paint. Now, I'm so in love with these that I use all kinds. I use one for my acrylics, I have one for my watercolors, I have one for my oil paints. Being a teacher and needing to teach from day to day, or from class to class, or from moving from building to building, you can see how this setup will really help you. Once I'm finished, I just clip on the top. It snaps to just like a Tupperware box. I can take it, I can put it in my locker room, I can put it in my car, and it's not going to get paint everywhere. Also, you'll notice that I'm using with my Masterson palette a paper palette. Now this is a paper palette. You can see it comes in a number of sheets all put together. And in this, once we're finished with painting, I can easily tear it up, roll it up, and throw it in the trash for easy cleanup. But I prefer not to throw the paint away while it's still usable. So that's why I can just use the lid at the end of a painting session. But when I'm finished, or when the painting palette itself is so dirty or so confused with color, then I can tear it away. Or if I want to start a new one, and I want to put out a fresh palette, then I can tear the paper away, easy cleanup, and get started on the next one. I've also included with this palette something that I think you would come in very helpful for, is these little clip-on metal cups. We'll use these later when we use our medium. What I usually do is I'll just pull up a couple sheets of paper, clip that clip on where that clip is, just put it on the paper itself, slide it in, and it'll hold itself in place at the corner of the palette. Also, you're going to need a couple of palette knives. Now I have two here, and I'm not trying to give any brand loyalty at all, particular palettes or materials, but I do want to talk about efficiency of cost and at the same time quality. These are some of the Liquitex stainless steel palettes. Palette knives. And one of the things I really want you to take note is how they're made. You'll notice this clean one-piece tang and palette knife and how much play there is. This gives you a lot of flexibility when mixing paint. They come in very handy for cleanup. You'll use them to scrape your palette. You'll use them to paint with at the same time. That being said, I have an example of another kind of palette knife. And I have many palette knives in my studio, but these are a little bit different. You'll notice here, especially, this is a tang that has been welded to the palette knife. Again, this is a very good palette knife. It comes in different shapes. They come in all different sizes. I use them for all different kinds of effects. But the weakness of this particular kind of palette knife is the weld. It will often, when you're being very vigorous with it, break off right there at the weld. Again, it's not super expensive. I prefer stainless steel or steel palette knives over plastic simply because from time to time in the art of painting or in the the kind of hectic pace of painting, sometimes you forget to clean it and you'll get a gunk up paint. Well, with a razor blade, I could just scrape that palette knife clean and it's ready to use and perfectly new again. There you go. When it comes to materials to paint with, let's talk about oil paint. I've got a palette laid out here already using what I consider a full chroma palette. To talk a little bit about those palette colors, I have a titanium white. Now, white is the color we use to bring the value of our paints up or down. And you'll notice that in the past, the masters used a lead white. Now it's referred to as a zinc white. Well, there are different properties between different kinds of paint. A zinc white or a lead white is very buttery and allows for the nice thickness and flow of paint. We know that it stands up over time simply because we have paintings 500, 600, 700 years old that still look very good. The lead white is almost always the strongest part of the painting surface. And when you mix a lead white with your color, it tends to bring the value up while still allowing to keep as much of the chroma or the intensity of the color as possible. A titanium white, which is an inert white and a very safe white, it allows you to bring the value of the color up, but it makes the paint itself much more opaque. It tends to kill the intensity or the chroma of the paint. So there's a mixture, and a number of brands make it, so I'm not going to tout one particular brand over the other, but a number of brands make it where it's a titanium and zinc white mix. That seems to be a very good combination. You can make your own up if you wish to, and I use that mixture there to bring my whites up. Speaking of whites, lead, zinc, materials of color, oil paint itself is nothing more than dried pigment that is suspended in a linseed oil. Some of the newer manufacturers are also suspending their colors in a walnut oil. Both work great. We know linseed oil has been around and been in use for hundreds of years. It's a great organic binder. It's very safe by itself. What makes oil paints unsafe are primarily the minerals or the heavy metals that might be used in the pigment. For instance, we talked about lead. Lead itself can be very dangerous. Now, the paint in this form, when it's wet, unless you pick it up and eat it, is not going to be dangerous to you. But once the paint is dry and you sand it and those particles can then get into your bloodstream, it can be harmful for you, so you want to be careful about that. Some of the other colors, like heavy metals, cadmium for instance, are very toxic. And again, suspended in the oil form, as you see here, unless you pick it up and eat it, it's not going to be dangerous for you. It's not floating around in the atmosphere. But again, if you sand it and then those fine particles get into your system, or if you happen to be having it on your fingers and you're a smoker or you're an eater and you ingest small particles that way into your system, it can be very dangerous. So one of my suggestions is to never eat while you're painting and never smoke while you're painting. The yellow we're seeing here is a cadmium yellow light. It's a perfect yellow. It mixes well. Cadmium colors tend to be a little on the opaque side, which is great. It mixes well and tints well with all colors. The next one is what we would call an earth color. It's a yellow ochre. It's probably one of the primary colors that oil painters have used for hundreds of years, and it's because it's a natural earth, or if you want to call it dirt color. It's nothing more than mineral, the ochre mineral, ground down to a fine powder, and then mixed with oil. Next to it is another earth mineral. It is raw umber. Raw umber is again one of those colors, and it's the deepest yellow we can get on the color wheel. Then I go to, and it's fairly opaque by itself also. The next color I go, you can see how I'm laying out my palette is almost in a rainbow chromatic transition from the highest value to the lowest values, from the yellow all the way around the color wheel. So these are my yellows and a white. They're the lightest colors so far on my palette. Then I come to the next transition, which is really an orange. This is a transparent Oxide Red, and I love this color. You can substitute it with a burnt sienna. A burnt sienna would also be another earth toned or earth pigment color that you could use. This particular one, because it's transparent, makes beautiful oranges when mixed with white, and also gives very nice transparent transitions for any colors that you might want to use. The next color on my color wheel would be Cadmium Red, which is a very toxic, again, color because it's heavy metal. Or you can use a substitute, which is now very safe, a Phthalo Red. They're both close within the same color range and pigment range, but because they're different colors, they will both mix slightly different with other colors. You just have to explore and experiment to see which ones you want to work with. Next to that, we have a cool red. You're noticing I'm also going from warm and cool, warm and cool. So we have a warm yellow and then a cool yellow. And we have a warm orange, we have a warm red and a cool red. This next red is Alizarin Crimson. It's a very cool, transparent color. It mixes well with other colors, makes beautiful purples when mixed with blues. This is just a mixed color. Sometimes you'll see it in tubes called a King's Blue. It's really nothing more than my Ultramarine Blue, which is a warm blue, but because I'm mixing with so many warm colors, mixes well and plays well with others on the palette. Another blue that you may want to add would be a Prussian blue, which is a very cool blue. Now, I'm asked a lot about phthalo colors. Phthalos are beautiful colors, super high intensity colors. And if you're painting very abstract or very high chromatic paintings, a phthalo blue, a phthalo green are beautiful colors to add to your palette. When you're painting naturalistic scenes though, and especially if you're painting flesh tones, you want to stay away from the phthalos simply because they are so strong. A little bit goes a long way. It will infect your whole palette very quickly. So here you're seeing an ultramarine blue. Again, its original color was known to be very expensive in the Middle Ages, and later it was made with a very rare element, and it was suspended in oil paint to get this super intense blue. Now it's much more affordable to us in the ultramarine form. Again, I said it's a warm blue, so it mixes well with all the other warm colors on the palette. Mixes very well with red, the Alizarin Crimson, to come up with a beautiful purple. And then my next and only green on the palette is a Viridian. Viridian green looks very much like you might think of as a phthalo green, but Viridian doesn't have the strong tinting power that phthalo would have. Again, it's a fairly transparent, translucent color. It mixes well with all the other colors on the palette. You can use it to bring down some of the reds as an addition to your complement, to bring down the value, to bring down the intensity, to bring down the chromatic strength of some of the warm tones over here on this side of the palette. And then you're often told not to include black, but black is just a color. Black by itself, though, will always look dead and empty. Most of my super dark colors are mixed with complements to bring it down, and occasionally I'll still add a black to it. Or if I want to add a really, really deep black that doesn't look empty, doesn't look flat, you can mix a black with any color along here, especially the deep reds, the ultramarine blue, even a deep green, to get a super rich black. And then what we paint with. Now, as I said earlier, oil paint is nothing more than just dried pigment that has been mixed with a binder. In most cases, that's a linseed oil, or it could be a walnut oil. There's an old-fashioned recipe when it came to painting with oil paints, and it would be made up of 1 part linseed oil, 1 part Daymar varnish, and 1 part turpentine. Well, one of the things we want to avoid in our 21st century palette is we want to avoid toxicity as much as possible. Turpentine is the first medium that most of us think of when we paint with oil. You instantly recognize that smell when you walk into an old-fashioned studio, but turpentine is extremely toxic. Its vapors are toxic. It's one of the few elements that allows on your skin can cross into the blood-skin barrier and carry any heavy metal elements such as paint that might be mixed with the turpentine into the bloodstream and into the skin. So we will avoid the use of turpentine for any purpose whatsoever in our studio. There are so many substitutes that work so much better, are safer, and don't have the smell. You can use cheap paint thinner. You see it in stores such as paint stores like Sherwin-Williams, and it'll just say mineral spirits. And it has a heavy, oily, greasy smell. That smell alone tells you right away that it also has a lot of other impurities mixed with it. The best one I've come across so far is a product made by Gamblin called Gamsol. It's a very highly rectified mineral spirit. If I were to open this, and I do have some open already here, you can't smell it in the studio at all. So it's a really nice product to use for your paint thinner, to clean your brushes with, and also to help with your medium. The other mediums that we use, because we're in the 21st century, we're using a lot of different alkyd-based mediums that take the place of that Damar varnish, turpentine, and linseed oil mixture. You can get these in a number of thicknesses. Itself, Liquid is a brand name. It's made by Winsor & Newton. There are others. Gamblin makes theirs. I think there are a couple of others made by Rembrandt makes its own also. Find one that you like. You'll just start using it simply because it's what you know. I don't see a huge superiority between one over the other. I would say you don't need much. What you would do here, in this case, make sure you shake it. It seems very thick and viscous, almost like jelly. But when you shake it, it turns into a liquid. And you just put a little bit into your palette, and that's all you're gonna need for a painting session, probably the whole painting. But I also like to paint with walnut oil. And again, the reason you need to have a medium is because when you thin your paints down with a mineral spirit, what you're physically doing is you're separating those small particles with thinner. Literally, it makes it thinner. You'll hear often when painting with oil, one of the rules is to paint fat over lean. So your initial lay-in, when they're talking about lean, meaning it's very thin. So in this case, I also want to suggest that you have a paint pot. These paint pots come in various sizes. They come with bell shapes. They come in any number of ways. The key, and what you really want to find, is something that has a strong, watertight and airtight lid. These clip on. There's a rubber gasket in there that gets pulled down super tight so it won't spill when it's in your locker, when it's in your backpack, when it's with the rest of your materials, when you're carrying it from class to class. These also come in jar form. They're much cheaper, but I've seen a lot of people use baby jars or fruit jars. I'm going to suggest you stay away from anything glass. I've been in too many studios. I can promise you, if everyone has one of these and it's glass, there's going to be a break a day. It's almost inevitable that you're going to drop this, it's going to knock off your palette, and you're going to have mineral spirits mixed with glass and old paint. So please, I suggest a metal paint pot. These are great. You'll also notice that it has a perforated cup. And what this does is it allows the mineral spirits, as you can see through there, in the hole, all the solids of your paint, whenever you're cleaning your brush, will settle to the very bottom of the can. Once it doesn't seem like it's clearing up anymore, you're going to want to clean this. Otherwise, it's going to get murky every day you paint. I do not suggest that you clean it every day. About once a week, depending on how many paint sessions you have. When it gets murky, pull the lid out, siphon off or pour off the clear liquid, clean out with a paper cloth, paper towel, a palette knife, whatever it takes, all the gunk at the bottom. I suggest when you're cleaning that out, and I'll give you a lesson on that later, that you put it into a separate dish that you can allow to air dry and become a solid again. It will be a toxic mixture, and if you throw that into your environment, you're throwing it toxic into your environment. You don't want to pollute your environment. But once it becomes a solid, it becomes a cake, it's encased again, it's no longer going to be toxic. Because it's oil, it'll dry eventually into a solid block. Then you're free to throw it into the garbage or dispose of it. Okay. That concludes our first introduction to oil paint.